I once was blind, but now I see. John Newton was a slave trader in the 1750s, and what's fascinating is he ends up being the guy who writes that song, Amazing Grace. Something that became such a powerful, powerful anthem for the civil rights movement was written and had its origins from a man who did decrepit and terrible things that are so obviously and purely evil. And what's interesting, that spiritual blindness that John Newton experienced so much reminds me of John chapter 9, where Jesus deals with the man who's physically blind. He was born blind, and Jesus ends up healing him. And what's fascinating is, in his experience with the Pharisees, who are questioning this blind man about all of the healing and stuff that he's experienced, he doesn't try and give any like deep theological answer or sound and add way more fluff than there actually was. All he's sharing about is his experience with Jesus and what God did for him through the person of Christ. And what's neat about that is it reminds me that like when people are honest and genuine and sincere and have the right eyes to see, it's incredible the things that can be shown and the deep levels of comprehension that can be had. And so what ends up happening with the Pharisees and that man who was blind is the Pharisees end up chiding him and throwing him out of the temple. And Jesus goes on to tell the disciples about the spiritual blindness of the Pharisees in his first kind of revelatory experience and showing that to his 12 disciples. And what's fascinating to me most of all, though, is that in John Newton's story, he retires as a slave trader in 1754 because of a massive stroke that he has, but the hymnals, that book isn't written until about 1780, 1779 or so. And it took all of that time for him to kind of recognize and understand how horrible what he did was and how he was able to finally put language in it. You know, he's reflecting in some letters that he writes in the mid-1780s and writes about how pathetic and embarrassing it was that it took him so long to recognize the evil, because he actually converts and has his spiritual experience with Christianity in 1748. So if you think about those dates, right, in 1748 he experiences Christ in a way that he says totally transforms his life, and then does 3 more slave trade runs until it's a massive stroke that causes him to retire. Not like the recognition of what he had done was so horrifically evil. And then he writes about being a wretch who was saved by amazing grace in 1779. So that's a long gap, right? That's a long period of reflection. But what's truly redeemable about his story, if there can be such an angle, is that he was finally willing to accept the spiritual blindness that he had. And that's a big personal application for us today. We all struggle with areas of spiritual blindness in our lives. There are all things that we don't like to admit about ourselves. There are problems that we struggle with. There are issues that we have that can be so difficult for us to see. And it's with the correct vision. When Jesus says, come and see, come and experience what life looks like with me, when I take those blinders off of your face and allow you to see what life is for all of its glory and hardships and difficulties, but its fullness, fulfillment, and meaning that you can have when you roll with me, when you're looking at life through the lenses that I want to give you. Right? And so that spiritual blindness, that's always removed through a couple of steps, right? First, it takes humility, it takes confession, and it takes a willingness to accept consequences. And if you're willing to do those 3 things, it will be incredible for you how much God can show you, how much God can move, and what he can do in your life. And so if you want to kind of explore this further, please feel free to message me. You can find me on Instagram. I'm at Joshua_Carmen. I would love to connect with you there. Thank you so much and have a great week.